let's just get started on some. Here are the issues that I was sort of hoping to cover today, and so I'll just give a quick overview, and then we'll be digging into each one of these issues. Some of them I know are probably words that are unfamiliar, so I'm just going to try to familiarize you with them now. But then, as I say, we'll be going into each of these individually. That's why, as Paul said, they're going to be sort of sections of what I'm talking about. It doesn't all sort of string together in a narrative that's sort of going anywhere but covering these individual sections. So please do feel free to interrupt if you wanted to ask about one section. So first of all, sort of mythology versus practice. When people engage in the scholarly study of religion, they'll talk about the mythology of religion, and of course, that will seem offensive to people who believe in that religion. But all it really means is the intellectual content of the religion, what the beliefs are, what the stories are that the people who engage in that religion would tend to share. And one of the things that I'm going to emphasize today is, and so like all religions, Greek religion had both an intellectual content or a cognitive content, what they believed, but then also there's a content in terms of practice, which would include prayer and sacrifice and a number of the other things that I'll be talking about today. What's different about ancient Greek religion compared to the religions that we're more familiar with is that by far, I don't think this point can be overemphasized. By far, the core of Greek religion, from the point of view of those who of the Greeks, right, of those who had that religion, the core of it was practice and not mythology. So let me just emphasize that. They did have their stories, but we get the word mythology from the Greeks themselves. They called their stories mythoi, which is the root of our word myth. So they understood that the intellectual content of their religion was mythological as opposed to factual. A myth isn't necessarily false, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily fiction and they didn't believe it, but that they understood that it was a kind of a representation of a reality that they did not take themselves to understand very well, but also it was a bit of an invitation to Greeks themselves to improvise a bit. So there was nothing wrong. There was nothing heretical or nothing impious about having some tragedy writer, for example, decide that he was going to represent Zeus in a somewhat different way than he had seen before, or he was going to tell a story that people would already know, but he's going to tell it differently and have certain things in the story that had not been in earlier stories of that particular mythology. There's nothing wrong with that. That was perfectly accepted. And the Greeks essentially assumed that that was what was going on. They didn't have doctrines. They didn't have dogmas. Now, where things got sticky and where things did require very careful accuracy is in the realm of practice. So if you do a sacrifice and you don't do it well, that would have profound implications. If you're praying and you don't do it in the right way, that would have profound implications. But in terms of the belief parts of Greek religion, that was pretty wide open. And so that's so very different from what we're familiar with. And the other thing is that given that sort of flexibility about mythology, there were many representations of gods and goddesses in literary sources might actually be quite outrageous. Comedies, for example, routinely, I'm afraid I may be breaking up. Let me wait a minute. All right, so let me start that thought again. Ancient Greek comedies frequently represented gods in extremely unflattering ways. And that was just good for a joke. So we need to be sort of, when we're trying to wrap our minds around what it was like to have this religion, we really need to release our own sort of presuppositions about what religion is and what it requires. The one place where there is a great deal more, as it were, dogmatic elements, as I said, would be in the realm of practice, but not in the realm of beliefs about the gods and what they do and how they act. So the other element that I'm going to be talking about, I'll just mention this word if you don't know the word, but syncretism is what happens when cultures blend. And the religion that ends up coming out of that blending of culture is kind of a mixture of the religions that had been the basis for either culture. I can give you a good modern example of syncretism in voodoo. So voodoo has Christian elements, but of course most Christians don't believe in voodoo, don't practice voodoo, and don't think it's entirely appropriate to their religion. But that's the result of a sort of syncretic connection between Christianity and the other culture, African culture in this case. So there are elements, and I'll be talking about them. The next bullet point is an example of evidence of syncretism. So in Greek religion, the Greek culture was composed of about 3 or 4 different groups of people that came to Greece at different times, blended in and became part of Greek culture, and each of them brought their own sort of cultural practices and religious beliefs. And when you get syncretic religious phenomena, very often their fit with each other is rather awkward. And so there are elements of this in Greek religion. And so as I like to say, Greek religion is a bit of a mess from the intellectual point of view because of some of these syncretic elements, and I'll talk more about that. Okay, one of the most obvious and dramatic places where you can see the difference between the syncretic aspects of Greek religion is when it comes to chthonic versus Olympian gods. Chthonic means sort of gods that are under the earth, beneath the ground, down there. I'll be making the point of that. We're not talking about demons or any, again, you just got to let go of all your sort of more modern religious notions. These are genuine gods, but they're gods that don't live on Olympus. The Olympic gods are sort of way up there on Olympus. But then there are these other gods, the chthonic gods, who are sort of below the surface, and up and down ends up being a really important part of various Greek religious practices as a result. And the syncretism ends up being particularly complicated when you get sort of chthonic representations of Olympian gods. And so that can sometimes happen. Before I started talking, someone asked about representations of gods in tragedy, in literature. And in some cases, this mix of chthonic and Olympian gods and chthonic and Olympian religion has a huge impact on the narrative of some particular story. And I'd be happy to give examples of that if you want when we get to that point. Prayer too. The way in which you pray is going to depend on which sorts of gods you're praying to. And I'll cover that when the time comes. And the same is true of sacrifice. These are notions that are familiar to us. But again, the way you would make a sacrifice would differ between the different sorts of gods. The Greeks believed in various forms of divination, and some of these terms may be unfamiliar to you, but divination is simply the practice or the process of trying to figure out some sort of information from the gods. If you want to know about something that's going to happen in the future, if you want to know about whether it's a good idea for you to do something, it'd be really great to be able to ask God what you should do. And since they don't have books, the Bible, for example, right? Since they don't have books that will sort of state the will of God fairly clearly for believers, they only have these myths, and the myths, again, they didn't fully trust, they didn't completely cleave to the material in the myths. And so it was a particular problem for them to try to figure out the will of the gods. Not just because there are many gods who might conflict in terms of their wills, but also just to figure out what would this or that god want me to do in this circumstance. And so various forms of divination are extremely important in Greek religion, and they also obviously create certain kinds of problems. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But anyway, this includes oracles. You probably have heard of the Oracle of Delphi. I'll be talking some more about there are a number of these oracular shrines around the Greek world. There are also Montes. Montes are just sort of soothsayers. They're people who at least claim to and who are regarded by at least some others as having a gift of sort of channeling the Greek will. And then there are these very strange people called kresmologoi. They are sometimes, the translation sometimes given as oracle mongers, which to me is a very strange notion. The idea is these people would collect oracles from around the Greek world, and they would have these collections, and then they, often for a price, they would monger these things. If you wanted an oracle that suited your political purpose, for example, as a politician, or you wanted an oracle that would sort of be a good one for some other thing that you're planning for that day or whatever, you could buy the services of this person who would come up with presumably authentic oracles that would seem somehow to serve that interest. Okay, healing and medicine. Greek religion, Greek medicine was for the most part a religious phenomenon. They did have the sort of Hippocratic people who were trying to engage in empirical medicine. I think it's fair to say that with respect to other than treatment of various kinds of injuries, Hippocratic medicine was probably as dangerous as whatever was ailing you. But they were trying to practice empirical medicine. But they also connected up fairly comfortably with the religious elements of healing and such. And they had a number of shrines around Greece. I'll be talking about some of these, where you would go to be healed. And you would pray to Asclepius or his father Apollo, and there would be ways in which you might attain healing. On the other side of things, suppose you wanted to make somebody's life miserable. Instead of healing or getting things better, they had various kinds of practices where you could potentially exercise, or the idea was to exercise a certain kind of control over other people. And obviously in the domain of the erotic, people would try to have, there were sort of not only aphrodisiacs supposedly, but there were kinds of magic where you could actually, if it works, right, you could recruit the assistance of a god in your attempting to seduce someone who appealed to you. Or suppose you had a political rival and you knew your political rival was going to denounce you at the next assembly, you might engage in some curse magic that would make him lose his voice. And I'll be showing you a particularly vivid example of curse magic that has been preserved. The, just as we have our religious festivals and holidays, the Greek calendar was really filled with festivals and holidays, and a lot of what we know of Greek culture is really a result of these festivals, because some of these festivals were literary. And so all of the tragedies, all of the comedies that were performed and that have survived were produced at religious festivals, festivals that were part of celebrations of the god Dionysus. And scholars to this day debate, well, what does Dionysus, the god of wine, have to do with tragedy? And there are some very interesting theories about that. The idea, in any case, is that a lot of the main aspects of Greek culture that have come down to us were for them deeply associated with religious festivals. So, as I say, the dramatic festivals, the Olympics, you've heard of the Olympics. They had various athletic games, not just in Olympia. They had them in Athens, they had them in other places, Nemea. All of these were religious festivals. So the Olympic Games were part of the signature religious festival of Olympia. That was their big event. And all of, again, we pretty much all that we know of Greek culture for them was associated with some festival or other. Obviously, there are very important religious implications involving death in the afterlife. Unlike, again, contemporary religion, the pictures of death in the afterlife in Greek religion were highly varied. In fact, they were so diverse, it's hard to imagine that they gave any comfort to anyone, because they really ran the range of, oh boy, that doesn't sound like fun at all, to, you know, fairly beatific view of what the afterlife might be like. And so I'll talk a little bit about that too. Finally, the final subject I wanted to cover is religion and the law. And once again, religious practice and religious requirements were deeply built into ancient Greek law. Just to give one well-known example, it's the last one I talked about when I talked with this group a year ago or so. And if you think about the trial of Socrates, Socrates was put on trial for allegedly violating the constitutional law against impiety, right? So here's a case where there's a direct, explicit legal prohibition against a religious malpractice. And so in that and a number of other ways, all of the festivals, for example, had a variety of legal mandates around them. So in law too, in daily life, in law, and in all of the elements of sort of human life, religion just saturated the environment. And I'm going to start getting particular. And if I have time, I'll also do a kind of a fun thing that I like to do with my students, and that is we can do a little bit of religious iconography. And there it's just a matter of looking at images from Greek art and figuring out what's being depicted by looking at various symbols in the art. And so we can do a little bit of that at the end if we have time. So any questions about these sort of broad, this laundry list of things that I'm going to get into? Okay, well, let's move here. Okay.
Laura?
Yeah.
Laura, did you have your hand up?
No, I did not. No.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry.
Okay, so just to emphasize and get into a little bit more detail, the source texts for Greek religion were not doctrinal, they were not definitive, there was no such thing as orthodoxy. The source texts were stories that were told, and people regarded them as stories. The stories were presumably edifying, they were interesting. Sometimes they were kind of exciting and exotic. But as stories, they lived or died on the basis of good storytelling rather than on the basis of having some special claim to truth. The authors of these stories, so Homer is a very important source in Greek religion. When Homer begins his Iliad, for example, by calling on the muses, come and help me tell this story and so on. And so the idea is that presumably there's some divine influence over the way he's going to tell his story. But the Greeks didn't see this as sort of in the same way as the kind of results of divine inspiration claimed in contemporary religions, where there are people who are, very special people who say the truth about God, and you must follow that. I saw that a hand went up.
Yes, I do have my hand up. As you give us this lecture, can you explain or keep us posted on what aspects of Greek religion has flowed into Christian religion?
Very little. Well, look, so Christian religion was framed at the outset as sort of by contrast to paganism. So if there's influence from Greek religion, well, first of all, we need to get our timing right. The Greek religion I'm talking about is BC, right? Before Christ. And so the Christians weren't really talking so much about Greek religion as Roman religion. But Christianity was originally framed. The way it was created was to make it a vivid contrast, a vivid alternative to Roman paganism, and the Romans really took a lot of their religion from the Greeks. And so if there's influence, it's essentially negative influence. It's by contrast to that the Christians were very well aware of paganism and Roman religion, which again was the ancestor of Greek religion. But again, the way they framed their way of doing things and their way of thinking was by contrast to that. The other thing was, of course, the historical roots in Christianity to Judaism, which is from a different part of the world and a different culture. So again, more by way of contrast than by way of taking over or borrowing. There are, if you wanted to get into details, there are traces, there are sort of whiffs of Greek stories or Greek myths that you can pick up in, say, particularly in Christian belief. The notion of a scapegoat, of somebody who is killed for our sins. You can go back and find that in Greek religion. But again, for the most part, let me just give you one more vivid example of this. The Greek word for divinity, again, Greeks had gods, but they also had, sort of little critters that lived in the forest, but they were immortal. I would call them godlets. So they had all these different kinds of the sort of the religious world, the divine world, had a number of different kinds of beings within it. So the generic word for divinity, which would include gods, but also, as I say, include these nymphs and other satyrs and various other kinds of critters. The Greek word for all divinities was daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N in Latin lettering. And here's where you can see what the Christians did, right? They turned the Greek word for divinity into their word demon. So Christians regarded pagans who worshipped daimons as demon worshippers. This is a very good example of an influence from one religion to the other in the most negative possible way, where the Christians are very carefully setting themselves over against this other religion that they want everyone to give up on as sooner rather than later. And that's a good example. So I hope that answers your question broadly, if not very specifically. Right. Gods in Greek religion, as everyone well knows, are anthropomorphized. And we do that, of course, too, but not the way the Greeks did. When people talk about anthropomorphizing gods, it really means that the gods have both our positive traits from a moral perspective and also our negative traits. The very idea, as I say on my slide, of treating gods as exemplars, you hear contemporary people talking about, well, what would Jesus do? And so the idea is if you can figure out what Jesus would do in this situation, well, then you can use that as an exemplar for your own behavior. The idea of doing that with gods would be not only outrageous, but literally impious, obscene for a human being to do. I could give you loads of examples of this, but for example, if you want to hear stories about serial rape, then just look into the stories about Zeus, the father of the gods. He was by all means the most prolific serial rapist that you'll ever read about in any religion of any kind. He was constantly jumping into bed with some new mortal, any immortals that he could jump into bed with, and so on and so on and so on. So the idea is, well, Zeus is constantly raping women. I guess I should do that too, and be like Zeus. That would put me in the way of all kinds of legal prohibitions, moral prohibitions. It would get me killed, is what it would do, and that's apparently how the associate of Socrates, Alcibiades, died. He was in bed with somebody else's wife, and that was the end of that. You don't take the gods as exemplars with respect to your own behavior. The Greeks regarded humans and gods as fundamentally different kinds of beings in one sense, and that would be the moral sense. But in other ways, the gods are very anthropomorphized. They get angry, they get stupid, they do things that are not really the right thing to do, and so on and so on and so on. But what they were not is exemplars in any sense. The other thing that I think we would find very unfamiliar about Greek religion is that strictly speaking, in the way that we normally think about worship, the Greek gods were simply not worshipped. Yes, we make sacrifices to them. We would pray to them. We would do all kinds of things that would recognize them, their authority, their power. But they were really treated. They could be immensely useful to us. They could be immensely good to us. They could do things that would be just make our lives wonderful. But they could also do things to us that we absolutely did not want them to do. And so really, I think that if you want to, again, this is speaking in very broad terms, the gods were basically, they needed to be dealt with. They needed to be recognized. Their power needed to be, on your mind. But this notion of loving a god to the point and worshipful and regarding them as a perfect being, that's just not there. They weren't perfect beings. They were dangerous. They could be wonderful, but they could also be just absolutely deadly and ruinous. And so, as I say, they're dealt with, but they're really not worshipped in the way that we think of what worship means in a contemporary religion. The most important difference, of course, is that the gods don't die. They are immortal. whereas human beings are mortal. And because we're mortal, that puts us in the way of something that none of us is particularly excited about happening, which is dying. And so because we will die, because we can die, because we are vulnerable to certain kinds of bad things happening to us, that just can't happen to gods. The way we shape our lives and the way we shape our behaviors and the way we shape our society amongst one another is sort of constantly needs to take into account our own mortality. But the gods don't need to worry about that. They don't, that's not an issue for them. And so the ways they behave towards one another all reflect this fundamental difference between them and us. And the ways they react to us also reflects that difference. And so that's really the fundamental axis about why the divine world is so different from the human world. Going to my next bullet point, I've really already made this point. Gods were not necessarily predictable. They were not necessarily reliable. The best assumption you could make when you're having to, as I say, deal with a god is to recognize at all times that the gods were selfish and self-centered. These are not traits that if I accused another person of being selfish and self-centered, it would be, I'd be criticizing them. I'd be saying that they have character flaws. These are not character flaws for the gods. This is just what they are. It's just how they are. And if you take that into account, you must take that into account when you're dealing with them, because the minute you sort of forget that, or the minute you decide to ignore a god, or as it were, treat a god as if he or she is not particularly important, they can, and as we find in so much of Greek literature, they will crush you like a bug, like an irritating insect. And not just you. If you get them really mad, they'll crush your whole family. And if you get them really mad, they'll crush your whole community. And it won't be because everyone in the community was evil. It won't be because the other members of your family did anything wrong. It just be because you messed up. And gods get to do that. Because in the end, there's really no penalty. Right? What are you going to have to? So you did a bad thing, God, so you're going to have the death penalty. Nope. They just get to do that. And in fact, in Homer, in the Iliad, for example, there are wonderful scenes where you see gods kind of bargaining with each other. There's a great scene, I think it's in book 4 of the Iliad, where Hera and Zeus are having a chat. And, Zeus says, all right, I know you hate the Trojans, so we'll let you smush the Trojans. But look, next time I want to smush a city, then you're going to let me do it, and you're not going to get in my way. Even if that city is dear to you, I'm going to smush it if I want to. So, okay, we got this deal now where you can smush your cities and I'll smush my cities, and we're not going to get in each other's way. But again, from the human point of view, the idea that gods would have such a discussion is just horrifying. But that's the representation of gods and how they were, at least in Homer. They had their own community, as I say, they had to deal with other gods in ways that could be difficult. There could be conflict. As I said in that scene in book 4, right? Hera and Zeus are in a conflict. She wants to, at one point, Zeus says to her, gosh, you hate the Trojans so much that if you could, you'd kill them and eat them raw. Imagine, Trojan sashimi. Right? Ghastly. But that's, but they're in conflict over the fact that, sort of, Zeus kind of wants to take care of Troy. He sort of likes them. Hera hates them. And so they make these bargains. They could certainly have conflicts. Their conflicts couldn't be deadly. But, they were they were vulnerable to each other in ways. So there are stories about being chained up forever. You're immortal, but some other god overwhelmed you powerfully. And so, yeah, bad stuff could happen to them. And so they had their own community, and they had to sort of negotiate the fact that they were members of this community. I've already covered the fact that they could destroy whole cities. Any sort of questions about human-divine relations? It's not a pretty picture, but that's the picture that we get in Greek mythology. Right, I'll move to the next slide.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to get on to Greek syncretism, but just to give you a sense of why there's so much syncretism. There's a number of Greek dialects. That's an indicator, right, that the settlers of Greece came from sort of different origins. They ended up with a common language, but the common language never was so common that it didn't have differences of dialect. We don't need to cover all the different dialects. We don't need to look. I know my slide is probably not readable unless you stick your nose on your screen. It's not important, but the point is, you just look at the colors. These were just different dialects of Greek are being spoken, which indicates, as it were, different ethnic origins of what become Greek-speaking people. And it's not just their dialects that are somewhat different. Again, they brought with them their own religious views, their own religious mythologies, their own religious practices. And we see traces of that by the time we get to the Greece of history. All right, so I mentioned what syncretism is. Greek culture of the different periods were the result of several invasions, interbreeding, cultural mixing. And the religious effects of this, and also the lack of orthodoxy, is partly the result of syncretism. And I like to describe it to my students as the religious equivalent of pizza. What do I mean? Well, what is pizza? You got a kind of some sort of basis, but then what you sort of throw on top of it to make the pizza, that might differ every time you make pizza. There's no absolutely one right way to make pizza. If you think that, you obviously haven't eaten much pizza. All right. So what's the biggest and most obvious example of syncretism? And this is also the most awkward example. By that I mean, it just clearly shows that within Greek religion, there's almost a fundamental contradiction. And that would be between the chthonic gods, and I mentioned that they're the undergods, the down gods, and the Olympian gods. And that just affects everything. The chthonic gods, I think a lot of scholars seem to think that they were mainly they were possibly or probably the gods of the original indigenous people of Greece. These were the people that got invaded, got colonized, got kind of taken over in the various invasions of Greece. But their religion persisted, and it found its way into sort of broader Greek religion. But the way the Greeks talk about the chthonic deities, they talk about them as if they're the older gods. And most scholars have taken that to indicate not just that there's a chronology of gods, not just that they have their ancestors, right? You may have heard of the gods and the Titans, right? Where the Titans are these older gods. But the idea is that they seem to have been gods who were somehow present in Greece before Zeus and the other Olympian gods, who are treated by the Greeks themselves as sort of later gods that were added subsequent. Now, there I'm sort of mixing up mythology and history, but again, I'm just representing what scholars make of all this. Um, so one of the things you quickly find out in literature and in mythology is that the chthonics and the Olympians don't really always agree or get along. In fact, it's more likely that they're not going to get along and that there's going to be conflict. A great example of that appears in Aeschylus's Oresteia, right, where the Furies represent the chthonic god's point of view, and Apollo and Athena end up representing the Olympian point of view, and poor old Orestes gets caught in the middle in the Oresteia. And so there's a great deal of conflict represented between the older gods, and of course the stories of the Titanomachy, the battle of the gods and the Titans is just a representation of how the Olympian gods and the older chthonic gods had conflict. But of course, you can't kill them because they're gods. And so what do you do with this conflict? Well, you kind of endure it, or you deal with it. Then the most confusing part of this, and I wish I could say something intelligent enough about it that it would make it clear to you, but you actually end up getting sort of chthonic and Olympian representations of gods that you would normally associate as the other kind of god. So you find, for example, often represented, the king of the Olympian gods is Zeus. But in several instances in the literature, in the mythologies, and in the literature, you'll find references to Zeus. I'm going to say it in Greek now, Chthonios, the chthonic Zeus. Now, who the hell is that? Well, that's the Zeus who lives under the earth. Wait a minute. Is that a different god than the Olympian Zeus? No. Same guy, but it's sort of Zeus insofar as he also is down there. And how does that work? Who knows? So let me just give you a theatrical representation of this. What am I talking about? How would that affect anything that you might ever read or do when you come into contact with Greek literature? Well, here's a very important example, and it's so easy to miss if you just go to the theater or if you just read the play. Sophocles represents Antigone in the play, named after her, in a way that clearly marks her off as religiously aberrant. Again, you never see this when you go to the theater, and most directors who put on the Antigone in modern day productions miss it altogether. They just don't see it. And so she's represented as, a poor victim of that nasty Creon or whatever. There's all kinds of ways in which they can play with these characters, but here's what you get clearly in Sophocles. The only gods Antigone ever refers to are chthonic gods. She very clearly is characterized as having turned her back altogether on the Olympians. And when she refers to Zeus, the only Zeus she refers to is Zeus Chthonios. So she's religiously aberrant. Now, what does that do to the play, just saying that? Well, if you go read the play again now, and you bear that in mind, you're going to see her character fundamentally differently than you probably would see her otherwise. So this is just one example where if you're alert, if you're able to, if you're in a position where you know what's going on and you see that certain people are, as it were, favoring some gods over others, that's always a mistake. You just can't get away with that. You might get caught between. That's what happens to Orestes. But you can't do that yourself on purpose. That's always a terrible mistake. All right. Any questions about this? I'm going to be talking more about chthonic religion when I talk about practices. But any question about this sort of syncretic aspect? All right.
George,
Oh, George.
Yes, the question. What role did faith have to play in Greek religion? And were there agnostics and atheists in the religion? If I say it's 430 BC and I walk up to Nicholas and I say, Dad, all this Greek god stuff is a bunch of BS, what would Nicholas say to me?
You'd probably get slapped pretty hard. Right, so faith, I think faith really, faith has to do with a kind of cognitive attitude toward religious truth, the religious entities and religious truth. So faith, again, really has no place. Um, Certainly you would need to believe in the gods, right? So if all you mean by faith is just believing that they're real, then yes, faith was certainly a part of Greek religion. But if you mean by faith a kind of trust in certain sorts of truths or recognitions of certain facts about gods that are dogmatic or doctrinal, no, there's none of that. Now, in terms of atheism, yes, atheism we know would have been a violation of the law against impiety because that's what they tried to hang on Socrates, and they hung it on him successfully. There's a wonderful scene in Plato's Apology where Socrates asks his accuser, impiety, what do you think I've done that's impious? What do you claim? Why are you saying I'm impious? And Meletus, the accuser, says, because you don't believe in the gods. So yeah, atheism would have been against the law, but it also would have been a dreadful religious crime. And why? Well, because if you're an atheist, you're not giving the gods their due. You're not watching out for what they can do to you and your neighbors and your family and your whole community, right? And so an atheist is an extremely dangerous member of society. If somebody's an atheist, you want them as far away as possible. Because if the gods get angry at that person's atheism, they could come and smush your whole city.
Connie,
Was there another question? Or?
Connie has a question.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Can you think of another religion that we would be a bit aware of, like Hinduism or something like that? Are there other religions where gods, and particularly where they have lots of them, would be seen more along the lines of you recognize their authority, certainly, but you don't worship them? That's kind of a new idea to me, and I just wonder if it's unique to the Greeks.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about Hinduism. Of course, Hinduism is polytheistic. And so they do have gods, and they've got some gods that are pretty negative, right? There's a god, I think it's Vishnu, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, who's a god of destruction, right? We don't much cherish destruction. And so there again, you might think that the proper response of a faithful Hindu would be to treat that god with respect, but you wouldn't love that god. But as I understand Hinduism, it doesn't quite work that way. That is, you kind of need all the gods in order for the world to work right. And so there is a sense in which you do worship all of the gods within their proper domain. But that's just not the case in the Greeks. And so, maybe the Norse gods were more like the Greeks. Again, I just don't know enough about that religion to comment. And so, as far as I know, to answer your question, but this is more about me than about the truth. As far as I know, this is an unusual feature of Greek religion.
Good.
Okay, so prayer and sacrifice. here's where the rubber meets the road, as they say in Greek religion. This is the stuff that was expected, where you needed to get it right, where deciding you want to do things differently would be extremely dangerous and extremely inappropriate. Essentially, the fundamental feature of prayer and sacrifice within Greek religion is this Roman and the Latin expression do ut des. You give in order to receive. So I make a sacrifice in order to get something from the gods. Now, what I might get from the gods is just that they don't smush me, right? I might make a sacrifice just to kind of keep out of trouble with them, but that's getting something from them, right? Or I might give the gods something in order to get something positive back from them. The Greeks are what's called a gift culture. We're all sort of familiar with this. We have elements of it in our culture too. So, for example, if somebody that you know gives you a gift, you might feel a bit awkward, right? This is an indication of a gift culture, because if somebody you know gives you a gift, it could be awkward because now you think, oh gosh, now do I have to give them a gift back? Think about the people that you have to very carefully negotiate with at Christmas. Hey, listen, let's make a deal, or whatever your holiday is. Let's make a deal. We're not going to gift each other, okay? Let's just not do that. But you've got to kind of work it out with them, because if you're at the receiving end of a gift and you're not giving anything back, you're not behaving very well. And so when somebody gives you a gift, you feel a little pressure. That's gift culture. But we've got traces of this. We've got little elements of this in even modern Mediterranean culture. This is much more powerful. And so if somebody gives you a gift, it's a burden that's put on you. And the ancient Greeks, this was very strongly the case for them. And so they treated their gods as part of their gift culture. If I want some goodie from a god, what do? I give them a gift, because that's going to put a burden on the god. Right? Now, of course, the god is free, because the god's a god, to say, thanks for the gift, but sorry, Charlie. Right? And there are numerous instances of that, for example, in Homer, where somebody makes a perfect sacrifice. And Homer, and the next line says, but Zeus sort of turned away, right? He accepted the gift, but then didn't come through with the goods. But that's the whole point. That's not the only point, but that's the main core of prayer and sacrifice in Greek religion. Is the gods sort of expected and demanded. The problem with this, of course, is that they expected and demanded to be honored, to receive gifts. And whether they wanted to give something back was sort of up to them. But if you didn't gift them, that is, if you didn't sacrifice to them, you didn't give them something that they wanted on a regular basis, you're just cruising for a bruise. Their demands, as I've already mentioned, Hera and Zeus kind of talking about smushing different cultures. Another great example of this in Greek literature that you may have read is Euripides' play Hippolytus. And what's Hippolytus about? Well, if you've never read the play, I'm gonna give you a spoiler, as it's called. So Hippolytus was a guy who decided that he wanted to worship Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. She's a virgin, a perpetual virgin, a forever virgin goddess. And he's going to worship her, and he's going to swear off sex. He's not going to have any sex. He's just going to be celibate. Imagine in contemporary religions that you know, where celibacy, or a vow of celibacy, is a religious crime. And that's the crime that Hippolytus commits. And what happens is, Aphrodite, the goddess of sex and love, crushes him and his family. The goddess of love doesn't react very lovingly. So this is an example in Greek literature. As I say, Euripides' Hippolytus, if you want to read the play. I've already told you basically what happens in the play. It's pretty ugly, but it's because somebody commits the crime of celibacy. All right. You didn't pray to, or make sacrifices to gain access to a good afterlife. That's another important point. I'll be talking about the afterlife later on. But the idea is it wasn't, you didn't do this with an eye to the afterlife. So that also is unfamiliar. You did this with an eye to life tomorrow, life today, life next week, but not with an eye to the afterlife. And finally, I just wanted to mention, not just gods, but also sort of famous dead people were worshipped in cult. And it was expected that their shades or their whatever survived their death could step in and assist you in some way. So there were cult activities, not just for gods, but for other beings as well. I noticed that it's 11. Should I break here?
Yeah, let's do a 5-minute break because we have a lot to go on. But let's take a little leg stretch and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Nicholas,
Yeah.
do you have a theory that about Socrates? Why did he opt to drink the hemlock rather than take a hike?
Yeah, well, what he says, and I can only sort of tell you what he says, in Plato's dialogue, the Crito, is that he says that he's, that one of the things we know that was part of his philosophy generally was that wrongdoing was always damaging to the person who did it. So I might hurt other people when I act badly, but I will always hurt myself if I act badly. What he says is that refusing to live in accordance with the laws of the city and what they decide is a very bad example of wrongdoing. And so in a sense, what Socrates drinks the poison in order to preserve his soul.
Say that again. In order to what?
You want to avoid wrongdoing at all costs. And Socrates thought that disobeying the laws of the state was a particularly egregious example of wrongdoing. And so in a sense, he chooses to die by drinking the poison rather than poisoning his soul with wrongdoing.
Almost a Thomas More.
There are other examples of this sort of, yes, faithfulness to a moral ideal throughout history. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you could say the same. You could say the same in some versions, at least, about Jesus, right? He chose to die rather than to do wrong.
Now, if let's say it's 430 BC, and my neighbor gets bumps or becomes a leopard or in some form accident loses his arm, do I assume that that's because the God was displeased with him?
That would certainly be a viable hypothesis. It's not necessarily true. It could, it could be that accidents happen, right? The Greek world is filled with all the there's bad luck and so on. But it would certainly be a viable hypothesis that if something bad happens, it's because some god had it in for him.
Yeah, very medieval.
Yeah. Before that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, everything in medieval times was, well, God didn't, you did something that God just you just believed God.
But the difference is that in medieval times, you could look at the poor fellow who lost his arm and decide that he's not really a poor fellow after all, because there's one and only one God. That God is completely good. And so if he lost his arm because that God was angry with him, he must have been a really bad guy and deserved it. The Greeks wouldn't think that, right? It could be that he lost his arm because he annoyed some god or goddess who was being really nasty. And then in fact, he's a pretty good guy and a good neighbor, and it's a shame that Aphrodite got so angry at him that she tore his arm off, right? But the idea, the implication that he's bad, you couldn't read that off of the fact that he got hurt. But you could in medieval times.
Well, I like the idea that you could prevent wars by holding back sexual favors.
Well, if you know, if it works, right? Whatever gets the job done, right?
Yeah.
Nice.
Did you know the Parisians put on a production of Antigone in '43 to defy the Nazis?
Yeah. Well, look, I think Antigone is one of the least understood ancient Greek plays because, you know, it from a modern point of view, there are so many resonances in the play for sort of contemporary points of view that people just can't take a step back and say, well, no, wait a minute, did it really mean that to an ancient audience? And the answer, I'm convinced, is no. I think I've never seen a modern performance of Antigone that seemed to me to be faithful to the original.
Well, in general, to me, it's rebellious.
Well, she is represented as being rebellious, and he's represented as being, you know, hideously overbearing. No one agrees with Creon. No one thinks he's doing the right thing. He himself is acting in ways that are irrational. But here's the part that everyone always misses. So is she, right? What we have are representations of human fallibilities across the spectrum of the kinds of stupid, bad things that people can do to themselves, to each other, to family members.
All right, about 5 minutes. Why don't we continue?
Are we back in business?
I think we're back in business.
All right, let's go back to business. All right. Okay. Oh, let me just say one more thing about prayer and sacrifice. I mentioned, this is not on my slide, but I mentioned, remember that there were the up gods, the Olympic gods, and the down gods, the Chthonic gods. Well, now here I'm going to have to gesture on my screen, so maybe you should be watching me instead of looking at my slide if you can. So when you prayed to an Olympic god, you would pray like, you'd raise your hands up, trying to, here, like this. You would pray like this. This is a gesture of supplication, also a gesture of prayer. But to an Olympic god, you would raise your hands up, and you would look up, and you would pray to the god this way, because the gods are up there. To a chthonic god, that is not at all how you would pray. The way you pray to a chthonic god would look to us like an Islamic prayer. You get down, you put your head down, and then you're not. It's not because you're bowing before what's up there. That would be what a Muslim is thinking. You're actually trying to get down to the god down there, and so you get on the ground, you put your head on the ground, you put your hands on the ground, and you make your supplication that way. That's one example. With respect to sacrifice, if you want to sacrifice to an Olympic god, what you do is you take the sacrificial animal, and of course, a nice part about Greek festivals and sacrifices is that most of the good parts of the animal get eaten by the people in the festival, which is a nice. So going to a festival is a nice way to get a really good meal with a lot of protein. Anyway, but what you would do to sacrifice an animal to the Greek gods, even though you're going to end up eating the meat, you take the fat and the bones of the animal, and you wrap the bones in the fat, and you throw that on the fire. And of course, you know what happens when you throw fat on a fire: a lot of smoke, everything, the fire and the smoke, and where does it go? It goes up. And even the Greeks themselves thought that there was something in this that was a little bit intellectually implausible. And you'll get situations in comedy, for example, where some character would say, "Really? What, the gods like smoke that much? That's just like they just get off on smoke, right? Come on, we're getting to eat all the good stuff, and we send them the smoke, and that's supposed to be all wonderful." But that was what you did. You would burn the fat and the bones, and the smoke would go up, and that was a proper sacrifice to an Olympic god. That is not how you sacrifice to a chthonic god. The way you sacrifice to a chthonic god is called, and here's a word that you're familiar with, and it comes from the Greek, is called the Holocaust. What do you do with a chthonic god? You take the sacrificial animal or whatever it is that you're sacrificing. It might be grain, it might be a bit of fruit, whatever. Often an animal, though. You take the animal and you kill it, and you let the blood flow down, and then you take the animal itself and bury it. You put the animal in the ground, right? It's not up, it's down. So you see what I mean? The sacrificial practices, the prayer practices involving these two sets of gods couldn't look any more different and couldn't be any more different in terms of the way they're actually carried out. So hopefully that's makes vivid just how different these gods are. Okay, oracles. This is way more than you ever wanted to know, and so this is sort of all about this slide is going to be all about Greek oracles, everything you ever wanted to know about Greek oracles, and a lot more. There were oracles all over the Greek world. The Delphic oracle is the one that we hear about because it was the one the most important and the most proximate to the Athenians, who were the sort of dominant literary culture of ancient Greece. And so, given that it's their sort of historical, their literature, their writings that have so much survived, we know a lot, we hear a lot about the Delphic oracle. The Delphic oracle was very important, not just to the Athenians, it was very important in the Greek world. One of the most important oracles in the Greek world. But it was not the only one. It was not the only important one. And so it was the one more or less local to Athens. It's the one that the Athenians have the closest access to. But I would say at least as important in the Greek world, more broadly speaking, was Dodona. Dodona is, as I say, it's sort of far to the northwest of Athens. It's not all that accessible to the Athenians. It's near the island of Corfu, if you know your geography, and near the modern border with Albania. So it's not close to Athens. And this is an interesting oracle because it's actually an oracle associated with Zeus. Most of the oracles are associated with Apollo. And we normally think of Apollo as the main oracular god. But Dodona was a place where you would get oracles associated with Zeus. Apparently there was a kind of a prior god, Dione, who was the oracular god, but then that blurs in with Zeus by the time we get to the classical period. Didyma is another very famous oracular shrine. So if you read ancient Greek literature, you'll find this one often referred to. That's very far east of Athens in what is now Turkey, across the Aegean Sea from Athens. But that one too was very important to the Greek colonies in on the other side of the Aegean Sea, and what is now sort of the coast of Turkey was all just Greek colonies back in the Archaic Age and also the Classical period. But then there are others that you'll probably never hear of, unless you really get into a kick and want to find out everything you can about Greek oracles, there are oracles at Klaros, at Troas, at Malleus, at Saura, and so on. I don't need to read the whole list. There's an oracle, if you look down at Labadea, there's an oracle to the Chthonian Zeus. I mentioned Zeus Chthonios, right? This chthonic counterpart of the Olympic Zeus. And there was actually an oracle to that chthonic counterpart, northwest of Athens. On various islands they had oracles. The point is, just to sum up, you don't need all these words, but to sum up, oracles were terribly important, as I say. If you want to know the will of God, you can open up the Quran and you can find out a lot. Maybe not the answer to your specific question, but you can find out a lot. And maybe you don't need to go any further. If you want to find out the will of God, you can open up the New Testament and you can find out a lot. Maybe not everything, but a lot. Maybe you don't need to go any further. Or the Old Testament or whatever, right? The Greeks had no way of figuring out what God wanted, any of their gods wanted, and so they relied very heavily on divination. And the most respected, the most trusted, the most important divinatory possibilities for the Greeks were these oracular shrines. And so any Greek in any part of the Greek world, by the end of the Archaic Age, the Greek world extended as far west as Spain, what is now Spain, just around Valencia, what is now Valencia. There was a Greek colony there. There were Greek colonies in the south of what is now France. There were Greek colonies in Sardinia, in Corfu, in all through southern Italy. There were Greek colonies in North Africa, and so on, right? And in West Asia. So if you're a Greek and you're living in a Greek community, you had to have access to an oracular shrine. And so we think of Delphi because that's the one that's so important in Athenian literature. But for a Greek living over in what is now Turkey, Delphi wasn't particularly useful. It's just too far away. You had to have access to one of these places. And so that's why they're all over the place. Notice the last one, Menestheus. There was an oracle near what is present day Valencia. And so on. They had to have these, that's my point. And so they were literally all over the place. Questions about that? Let's go on. The less reputable forms of divination, which were a lot closer to home and therefore a lot more easily accessed. But all of what I'm about to talk about, they're in the literature. If you read Greek literature, it's very hard to find much evidence. You can find little snippets of authors who occasionally doubt the shrines, the oracular shrines I was talking about. You find people who kind of wonder whether Delphi is, there's very little of it. But there's a lot of doubt. George was asking about atheism. This isn't atheism, but it is religious, it's authentic religious doubt. The soothsayers and oracle mongers that existed in every Greek society were regarded with a great deal of skepticism. The good news is everybody needs to know the will of the gods. The bad news is your oracular shrine might be a couple of days hike away. So if there's somebody closer to home that you can consult, that's very tempting. And if that person seems to you to get it right once or twice, that person now has a client. And so there were these people, they're the famous ones of literature, Calchas in the Iliad, he appears in the Iliad, and of course he never gets it wrong in the Iliad. Tiresias in Sophocles' plays, in particular, never gets it wrong. Odysseus doubts him though. Sorry, not Odysseus. Oedipus doubts him, and oops, not the good thing to do. Creon doubts him in Antigone, not a good thing to do. So here you find, Agamemnon doubts Calchas in the Iliad, but goes along with it. So these methods of divination, these people who can help you find out what the will of the god is, even in the literature that points to them as inerrant, there are doubters. But in Greek society itself, we know there are serious doubters of these kinds of people. Cassandra is another example, who appears in the Oresteia, in the play Agamemnon. But others who were very famous, there's one called the Sibyl, and it turns out there were actually 10 Sibyls around the Greek world. These were apparently female soothsayers. And again, they're regarded by many as extremely reliable and important, and by others as complete frauds. But certainly the Sibyls were very famous and highly regarded. Being a mantis, being a soothsayer, was a teachable skill. And we got artifacts, actually, which look like teaching tools, how you would teach someone to have this skill. And so there were ways of learning the skill, and you could go to school. I guess you could go to somebody who was supposedly a master. But it could also be a gift or a curse from the gods. Soothsayers were regularly included and consulted on military campaigns, and as Thucydides says, with utter contempt. That's why the Athenians lost this devastating loss in Sicily. It's because Nicias, the general in charge of the invasion, too much trusted these people, and instead of using his prudent general mind, he let himself go religious, and it was the end. Right? So the author Thucydides is one that I think we can fairly count as a significant doubter of this kind of activity and of people who allegedly had the skill. I'm going to just give you one anecdote from my own personal experience. When I went I did a postdoc with a fellow at Stanford who taught me an interesting trick about the religious practice of a mantis at a blood sacrifice. So when you sacrifice a bull, one of the things that would happen is the tail of the bull, or an ox, the tail of the whatever it was, an ox or a bull, would be put on a fire, and the mantis, the soothsayer in charge of that, would ask a question on behalf of the gathering for the festival, and then would get an answer from what would happen to the tail as it was on the grill, as it were. And we actually enacted this. We got an oxtail, and we put it on a grill, and he showed me how this worked. Michael Jameson is the professor's name. If you take an oxtail and you put it on a grill, what'll happen is, oh, by the way, you ask the tail a question. And if the tail curls down, the answer is no. But if the tail curls up, the answer is yes. Well, now here's something that any mantis would know, but ordinary people might not. As long as you put the tail on the grill the right side up, what will happen as the tail begins to cook is it will start to curl down, which of course very dramatically is an indicator of no, but then it'll curl up. And so you can always get the answer yes, if you want. Or you could always get the answer no, if you want, right? Depending on which. All right. So some people may have actually noticed that and realized, you know, this is fraud. This is fakery. But that's one example. Now, the people that Aristophanes can never get enough of making fun of, and talk about sort of trash talking a whole wing of your own religion. There were these people called oracle mongers, I mentioned them. They collected and sold oracles for private and public uses. So this was their business. And every time one of these characters appears in a play by Aristophanes, in a comedy by Aristophanes, they're a complete fraud. But this was a very common practice in Greek religion, and a very common, unfortunately, also common practice in Greek politics, where this religious phenomenon was often employed for persuasive reasons. And Aristophanes just never gets tired of pointing out to his audience that these people are frauds. They're liars and frauds. But again, it wouldn't be there for him to make fun of if it wasn't quite common in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so questions about this? All right, healing and medicine. Those are not severed limbs, so don't worry. This is not going to get R-rated. What are those? Those are offerings. They're plaster cast offerings at the Asclepion. An Asclepion is a building, a temple dedicated to Apollo's son Asclepius, who's the god of healing. And what you would do if you had an injury or some sort of infirmity, you would go to an Asclepion and you would pray to the god, or you would, if you're really lucky and you're really and you're rich, so you leave enough money at the shrine to the priest who's governing the treasury, you can actually spend the night sleeping inside the temple. And if you have a dream where Asclepius comes to you, you'll be cured. But maybe you just go and you're not high budget, so you just go and you pray, and then you go home again, and you find that your leg, look at all those legs and feet, and you find that the festering sore in your leg goes away. Well, you've been healed because you prayed at Asclepius. And then what you do is there are shops that sell these things. You buy a plaster cast of a leg and you go and you leave it at the Asclepion where you went to get your cure. And so when people excavate, there are these buildings all over the Greek world. Sophocles, we know, actually donated to the Athenian people. The playwright Sophocles donated to the Athenian people an Asclepion. He actually financed the building of the Asclepion in Athens, just as a gift to the state. But these were all over the Greek world, and when you excavate them, what you find is you find these weird artifacts, and these are just offerings of, presumably if you see a lot of legs, I guess they had problems with their legs. I wish I could show you a really good close-up of the one in the middle. One in the middle is a fellow actually carrying one of these offerings that's almost as big as he is. Right? It's a leg. You can see maybe this guy's carrying this huge leg, which is a really nice offering. But what's interesting is if I wish I could show it to you up close, but if you look at the offering, you can see a very oddly pronounced vein. And so people have hypothesized, I think plausibly, that this fellow who's making the offering, the guy who's carrying the big leg, had problems with varicose veins. He prayed and somehow felt like he was cured, and so he's bringing this big offering to the in this case to the physician Aminos. He brings it to the sanctuary, and then there's this wonderful other one. You see this? You can see my cursor. This big old leg here, right?
Uh-huh.
And the inscription says, "Thanking gift to Asclepius." And Hugea would be the female person who accompanies Asclepius, and her name just means health, so she's Ms. Health. But that's what the inscription says from this guy. I mentioned dream incubation, where you go and sleep, and if you get a visit, you're cured. But anyway, this is sort of the mixture of religion and medicine. It's about as good as you could get in the ancient world, as you can imagine. I'll just give you a quick statistic. This is not on my slide. Illness, disease, mortality, these are problems for all human beings always. But just to give you a sample, it's estimated that something close to 50% of the living human beings in the Greek world were under the age of 18 at any given time. 50%. Why is that? Because a lot of people weren't living much longer. Something like the people who lived to age 40 were only maybe 1 in 4. People who lived to age 60, maybe 1 in 20. So life expectancy wasn't particularly good. On the other hand, if you compare it to world life expectancy in the 1990s, it was comparable. So, life was tough, but it wasn't as bad as you might have thought. For women, of course, complications of childbirth, early marriages and such, it was rougher. It was worse for women.
Mhm.
Unlike these days, women live longer than men. In those days, not so. All right. Curse tablets. These are somewhat fun. These are not the nicer aspects of Greek culture. So what you would do with a curse tablet is, if you have a political rival, this one is Roman. It's vivid, but again, this practice goes all the way back. The Greeks use this regularly. You find these things, archaeologists find these things, it's troves of them periodically. But here's one that's you can find it in the museum in Bologna, and it's Roman. So it's the first known surviving curse directed at a Roman senator. It's written in Latin with some Greek invocations, and it says, "Crush, kill Fistus the senator. May Fistus dilute, languish, sink, and may all of his limbs dissolve." Right? He wants him to melt when he goes into the Senate. So what would happen is you would get a bit of lead foil, and you would take a sharp instrument, and you would inscribe your curses into the lead foil, and then you crush it up into a ball, making it difficult for archaeologists then to unfold it and figure out what the curse was. Crush it up into a ball and throw it down a well. That's good news for the archaeologist, because if you find an ancient well and you go to the bottom of them, you're probably going to find it littered with these things. Right? But there are all kinds of these things, and they're never very nice. What people want to happen to their rivals is sort of what you would expect of human beings. But anyway, they're very common, and this is where religion meets almost just magic. a lot of times you wouldn't even find any references to gods or anything, just a curse. All right, now is where we get to the R-rated bits. Sorry, this is an actual object. It's called the Louvre doll, some doll. This is an example of erotic magic. And once again, it's just as ugly as anything could possibly be. This is an actual object that was used as this, and again, cursing and erotic magic are really treated as part of the same kind of phenomenon. It's about controlling other human beings in magical ways. So this object was found down a well, and with a curse tablet right connected to it. The guy who was making the curse, either it was him who made the curse, or he commissioned a magician to do it for him. This Sarah Pamon. Do not allow her to eat, drink, hold out, venture out, or find sleep. Drag her by the hair, by the guts, until she no longer scorns me. So Sarah Pamon has the hots for some girl who's not interested. And so he creates this voodoo looking thing and takes a curse tablet in order to try to control her. And just again, one of the world's authorities on this is Chris Ferroni, University of Chicago. He says, well, what I discovered was that most of the technologies that are used in spells for throwing erotic passion into someone are borrowed from the realm of cursing. That's why they, partly because of his work, now sort of erotic magic and cursing magic in the ancient world are really treated as two sides of the same coin. But I promise this is the ugliest, most disturbing thing you'll see during the lecture. Let's get away from it unless somebody wants to ask me something. Pretty awful. Sorry. Let's get on to somewhat more soothing things. Festivals and religious sites, they're all over the place. Again, this is more than you ever wanted to know about festivals and religious sites around Athens. But the Panathenea is one of the biggest of these events. They had contests, athletic and artistic. You've heard of, you know about the tragedies were held, I assume during what was called the Greater Dionysia and the Lanaya. But these are, again, religious festivals for Dionysus. There's a festival of wine, which was obviously pretty important in the ancient Greek world. There was a festival just for women, the Thesmophoria. And of course, you know, good old Aristophanes, he had to have some fun with that. And so there's actually a play by Aristophanes that supposedly takes place, quite comic, as you'd expect, at the Thesmophoria. Women at the Thesmophoria is the name of the play. John Michelson, in his book, The Sacred and Civil Calendar, which is about the Athenian festivals, suggests that the total number of positively dated festival days, the total in the two different lists, is about 120 festivals during the year, about 33% of the days of the year. So when you worked, if you ever used to work, and I assume most of you did, or all of you did, imagine having a third of the year set aside where you didn't have to work, because that would be a festival day. And of course, that wouldn't apply to agricultural workers. It would only apply to the people who could really afford to be at the festivals. But yeah, these were legal holidays, about a third of the year. So if you think we overdo it, not even close. This will put you in the Christmas spirit all year long. All the games, the athletic games, these are very widely done. I said there were healing temples. There are sites for mystery religion. That's where you would go to get a good afterlife. I'm not sure whether I'll get to that. This is also a little bit shades of the last slide, but there were places you would go to engage in prostitution as a religious practice. Most of the temples dedicated to Athena had brothels. So you would go there to celebrate Aphrodite. Did I say Athena? Sorry, Aphrodite. You wanted to go and worship Aphrodite, they had a brothel there where you could do just that. And of course, that brothel would help to fund that religious site. All kinds of crazy rituals that you want to learn more about. The little bears of Brown, the ritual whipping, at various places. It just gets wild. I don't even need to go on. They had scapegoat rituals, they had werewolf rituals, all kinds of cool stuff. Just get to this and then maybe we should see if people want to ask more general questions. Death in the afterlife was not, there's no doctrinal truth here in Greek religion. They have all kinds of stories about the afterlife. The most famous one, or one of the most famous ones, appears in book 11 of Homer's Odyssey. And there, the afterlife just stinks for everyone. You become a shade, which is just like a ghost without any powers of any kind. You can't even speak unless somebody gives you fresh blood to drink. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes into the afterlife and he sees Achilles, and Achilles says, "Man, it really sucks down here. This is terrible." So it's not a very nice place to be. There's also, of course, the Elysian Plain, and I've given you a couple of quotes there. The Isles of the Blessed, as it's sometimes called. But how do you get to those things? Well, usually you get to those things because some god has decided he likes you enough to put you there. Achilles was out of luck. Mystery religions would promise a happy afterlife for all initiates. You didn't have to be a good person. You didn't have to follow anything. You just had to get initiated, and you were in. So if you wanted a good afterlife, the way to get that would be to join a mystery cult. The famous one for the Athenians, because it's walkable, was the one at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries. Finally, just to mention, in the Iliad, Homer somewhat mysteriously mentions sleep and death, who are twin brothers, which seems to indicate that the Greeks also regarded, and there's a moment in Plato's Apology where Socrates says, yeah, well, maybe death is just annihilation. You just go away and nothing is left. That's at least hinted at also in Homer. So just giving you a sense of the variety of afterlife ideas that are available to the Greeks. Some other Greeks believed in reincarnation. So there's just, the picture is all over the place with respect to death in the afterlife. So I do have more slides, but I'm wondering if maybe it wouldn't be best now to just, what do you think, Paul? I can go on, but I'm wondering if maybe.
Well, let's see. Are there any questions?
A lot of material I've thrown at you all at once.
Jim,
Yes. Okay. So thanks. Very
you're
much,
muted. Jim. No, there you go. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Nicholas, for that presentation. I learned a lot. Question I have is that when I was an undergrad, I took a classical literature course, and I don't remember at all any kind of survey of all this information that you provided today, maybe compacted, to help me have a background in some of this before we jumped into a lot of the Greek classics. So when classes at Lewis and Clark or maybe other universities are teaching that either as part of the literature department or the philosophy department, do they regularly get kind of this background, more or less, maybe shortened, maybe not, before they go ahead and read those classics?
Well, not necessarily. So look, Greek literature, I think rightly, is celebrated for its inherent interest, for its humanity. That is, the Greeks represent us to ourselves in ways that are familiar, sometimes disturbingly familiar. All of our foibles, all of our mistakes, all of our fallibilities, all of our frailties. The Greeks are very good at representing that. They make fun of it in their comedies. They make it tragic in their tragedies. And all of us experience in our lives, you know, tragedy and laughter. And so I think in order to enjoy and appreciate Greek literature, you don't have to know any of this. The point I'm trying to make earlier about the Antigone in particular is that if you do know this, it will change what you see when you go to a play, and it will change what you understand when you read some Greek literature. But you know, it's good news and bad news, right? So it's entirely possible that if you know what I just told you about Antigone, and now you go and you reread Antigone, you won't find it as exciting, right? So there are feminist readings of Antigone. Let me just give an example of this. So a lot of people like to read Antigone about the toxic effects of male domination. And so Antigone is characterized as, you know, an innocent female victim of older male oppression. And that really works for them. And so when people who, you know, that's what they want, and they go to Antigone and they read it, or they go to it performed that way, and they come away feeling like, oh my God, all the way back in Greek times, they saw this truth. And the play works for them that way. I don't think that's what was on Sophocles' mind at all. But there's a feature of literature where, in a certain sense, the truth ceases to matter. I hate to say that these days, but where what matters is what you take away from the story as a consumer of that story, as an audience to that story. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I think there's important connections between Greek religion and a lot of the literature that we will understand the literature better if we know this stuff about Greek religion. On the other hand, it's not at all clear to me that knowing this stuff about religion will actually make the literature better literature to a modern audience. And so I think what happens when people teach this literature is they decide for themselves, perhaps, how best to present it to a modern audience so that it will live another generation.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's interesting.
Any other questions? George?
Yes, you mentioned or sort of emphasized that the gods were immortal and humans were mortal. In other words, human life came to an end.
Right.
Now, if you go to an afterlife, you're giving humans an immortal element. So they become godlike.
Yes
So
and no.
Huh?
Yes and no. Boy, that's important though. Yeah. They become godlike in the sense that they don't actually just die off and disappear. They're not completely extinguished or exterminated. But on the other hand, they're not godlike at all, because in a lot of the pictures of the afterlife, even though they're still there, they are utterly powerless. They are powerless in ways that they, if you give them the opportunity to speak, that they will report as extremely unpleasant.
But they do their argument an immortal element.
Yep, that's right. And the Greek philosophers have a picnic with this notion that each of us has within us a kind of divine element. But to have a piece of the divine isn't the same as having all of it. Let's be clear.
I know with wine, wine can be both good and bad. If you drink a little wine, you're getting the good aspect. If you drink too much, you're getting the bad elements.
That would map onto my experience pretty well. But unfortunately, I think in the case of divinity, there's no such thing as too much, and there is such a thing as too little.
Any other questions?
I can suggest that we play a little bit with iconography. Would people like to do that?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, we have some time.
Yeah, all right. So let me skip a slide, and let's do some Greek iconography. This is fun. I enjoy this. I don't know whether you do, but I make believe that my students enjoy it with me. All right. So iconography is the academic or whatever enterprise of reading symbols in artworks in particular. And so if you go to any museum and see some of the Greek artworks, in particular vase painting, that's what I'm going to be focusing on mostly. In Greek vase painting, you know, the problem is very hard when you're crafting an image onto the surface of a vase, and you're not painting it in. You see here a lot that some of it's painted in, but it's very, very two-dimensional. And if you look at all the really white things in the image, right? A lot of this white, all of that is done with incision. It's done by actually scratching it into the surface of the vase. And so it can be a little bit hard unless you're really, deeply engaged in the culture. You know, for us, we can look at this, well, I don't know, a lot of people waving their hands around, what's going on? But, you know, I can't sort of tell you everything you might ever want to know about this vase, but with just a few little observations, you can begin to do some of this. You can begin to read this image a bit. So let me give you a good example. You see this thing here? Anyone tell me what that is?
Trident.
It's a trident. Good. And so who would be holding a trident?
Neptune?
What?
Zeus?
Well, I heard
I don't see
Neptune, which
anything.
is,
I don't
which is
see anything.
almost right. Neptune is the Roman version of this Greek god.
Uranus.
I didn't hear, I'm sorry.
Poseidon.
I don't see anything.
Ah, right. Okay, off to the right side here.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
See
I see
that?
it. Yeah.
That's the end of a trident, and that's the indicator of the Greek god Poseidon, who becomes Neptune when we get to the Roman version. All right, so what the Greek artists would do is they would use these symbols to identify different people in the scene, and so now we know, well, this is Poseidon, because nobody else would be holding the trident. Okay, that's good. Now, here we have a much more difficult one. Look at this. You see that?
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like he's holding an ear of corn that's kind of frayed at both ends. Now, this is more difficult, but if you look at enough of these, and you only have to look at about 5 or 10 of them, and you get the idea. So you'll just have to trust me on this. But as you can imagine, there are certain iconographic symbols that are a little bit hard to represent visually. And one of them is the iconographic symbol of the god Zeus, the thunderbolt, right? A lightning bolt. And so this funny looking, almost looks like, as I say, an ear of corn. Well, it can't be an ear of corn because corn isn't indigenous to that part of the world. It's a new world crop. But that is a fairly typical ancient Greek representation of a whole handful of thunderbolts. So we know this is Zeus. Now, I mentioned the gesture of prayer, right? So here we're seeing a lot of gestures of prayer. And here's another god I can identify for you. Look at the funny shoes on this fellow. Now, there's an easier way generally to tell who that is, because generally he'll have another bit of iconography. But luckily, here we're given a little bit of help, because notice what he's got in his hand. What is that?
A goblet?
No, you see, it's on a stick. It's an axe head.
Oh,
It's the head of an axe, a two-headed axe.
Oh, yeah.
All right, now, because I know a little bit of Greek mythology, now I've just figured out what I'm looking at. Why? Well, look at this one. There's this funny character up here. Looks like she's sitting on this fellow's head. This is Zeus, remember? I knew that. And it looks like some figure in armor. Very small. But the other thing is, well, it's got a spear and armor and stuff. And the
warrior.
No. You know what you're looking at? You're looking at the birth of Athena. The warrior goddess, Athena, who was born out of the forehead of Zeus.
Hmm.
So you're looking at a birth, the scene of a birth, and Hephaestus here has just knocked a hole in Zeus's head so Athena can come out. Isn't that fun? Let's do another one. Oh, this is a lot easier. You see, the Greeks were helpful sometimes. You know, in case we didn't get it, in case we're such crappy iconographers, they sometimes help us by actually putting the name of the god right on in there. So this one's labeled, right? This is Zeus. There's not much of a thunderbolt there. This one is Aphrodite. Thanks for the help. And she's got her little Eros there with her. The other thing is there's this interesting little thing here called an inux, that if you've seen enough imagery of Aphrodite, this is one of her iconographic signatures. So it's nice when it's labeled. Let's do maybe one more and then we can. Again, if it's labeled, it's really helpful. So here we see a label, right? Unfortunately, it's Hermes, but he's off the screen. That's not going to help you very much. But here we have Artemis, right, and various others. So we're actually getting them labeled. That's not the most interesting. Let me try one more. Okay, guys, last slide. Who is this? I've told you how to do this.
That's a bolt of lightning, right?
You're
His
good
hand?
on you, George. You
Huh?
win the prize. You win the prize. There it is, that funny looking corn looking stuff.
Yeah.
Lightning bolts. He's got a handful of lightning bolts. There is Zeus for you. All right. So now you know a little teensy bit about reading Greek icons.
Whoa.